Hello there! Welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world. I hope you're doing great. I'm doing fabulous, thank you very much. And I'm so excited about part 4 of our story tonight. I don't know about you, but I'm dying to know what happens. So, so many curiosities in this story, so many idiosyncratic things going on. So it's terribly, terribly exciting, which is our final part of the story. Sometimes it's 5 chapters, sometimes it's 4, and tonight it's 4 chapters. So let's continue, shall we? And an idiosyncratic two-way telepathic exchange appeared to begin between the two of us, without me so much as even opening my mouth. Everything was completely governed by thought. I was thinking to myself, was it really you speaking to me? And the voice returned in my head. Of course it was me speaking to you. And I won't let you jump into that water. If you attempt to do something like that, I will simply save you. I began to challenge the creature in my head, with words that were only thoughts, but the Bigfoot comprehended them all. But you don't understand. I need to do this, I insisted. It's the only way I can be free. You only need to do one thing, and that is to abandon this preposterous idea, he told me. But I don't want to. Don't you see? I need to do this. Why are you so eager to leave this world, when it is clearly not your time to go? Because I'm too sad to carry on living, I explained. Everyone gets sad from time to time, but you cannot let it devour your life. You need to go home and get those silly ideas out of your head. Yes, you're hurting now, but the pain will soon pass. It will become bearable with time. We all lose things we love. I see it in the natural world all the time. The mother bird loses her fledglings. They drop out of the nest, but she doesn't dwell on what happened. She starts again, weaving her nest as if it never happened. She returns to making another one and continues along on her way. She doesn't allow sadness to cloud her life, to rob her of her day, and neither should you. You must go home now, like the bird, and rebuild your nest. Don't cry over what you cannot change, as nothing you lose is lost eternally. Surely you must realize that. What is lost will one day be restored. Maybe you're right, I said. Of course I'm right. I'm seldom ever wrong. Munchali is always right, came his response. Now go home, build that nest, and don't come here with any weird thoughts in your head. The next thing I know is I'd climbed off the bridge and began to walk towards the trees, where I'd seen the Bigfoot that had communicated with me so eloquently. But when I looked around, he was gone, and I felt a bitter sense of disappointment that he was no longer here. Where had he got to? He'd been there only moments before, and his words in my head had been so authoritative, so commanding. And yet he had spoken with such a soothing countenance and such a great warmth that I felt I needed to listen to his wise counsel, and I wanted to speak to him more. But no, he was gone. I found an incredible sense of peace had washed over me, and even though Stephen was dead, I no longer felt quite so devastated about his loss, as if somehow my grief had become anaesthetized and soothed, like a festering wound that had been treated with a powerful anti-inflammatory, and was no longer so rudely inflamed. I suddenly observed 2 fishermen had arrived on the scene. They were at the lake early in the morning, ready to go fishing. It was too late for me to commit suicide now. One of them was shouting to his friends, with a note of spirited enthusiasm in his voice. Look here, Sid! Look at this footprint in the mud over here! Look at the size of this thing! You don't think it's a big footprint, do you? The 2 men began excitedly studying the print on the shore of the lake, and I left them to it. I promptly returned home from the lake. The desire to commit suicide seemed to have left me. After the Bigfoot had insisted that it was not my time to go, and he had said this with such conviction, I was to discover that he had given me sagacious advice. For indeed you never get over the hurt and grief of losing a loved one, but with time their absence from your life becomes more bearable. I always pondered as to how the Bigfoot, who communicated with me so telepathically, appeared to know so much about me. I know without a shadow of a doubt that he is the reason I did not jump over the bridge that day, surrendering my life to a watery grave, and for that I am profoundly grateful. In hindsight, I suspect the Bigfoot had followed me through the woodgrove to the lake, but how he had known what I intended to do. I put this down to the Bigfoot's remarkable ability to read my mind. I was now significantly older and a whole lot wiser. My suicide intentions long behind me, a fleeting memory, so to speak, that seemed like a whole lifetime ago. Something I never cared to reflect over, as when I did it made me feel dreadfully guilty about the potential distress I would have ultimately brought upon my whole family, and if my body had never been recovered, they would have had no closure in their lives. Getting back to the present day, my mother had been so pleased to learn that me and my brother Adam were spending the entire weekend with her. It had certainly been an enjoyable afternoon. Even though without my father being around, the cabin really did not feel quite the same. That night when I returned to my old childhood bedroom in the cabin, that my mother had kept exactly the same as the day when I first left home a couple of years back. I suspect she deliberately did this so that I always knew that no matter what, I would always have a home back at the cabin. It was reassuring to be in my old bedroom again, and I suddenly felt like a little kid as my head hit the pillow and I fell into a blissfully deep and peaceful sleep. In my dream I found myself walking through the woods and getting to the lake, where at one point I had attempted to take my own life, and there standing on the bridge was my father. He was waiting for me. I hurriedly ran over to the bridge, throwing my arms around him. "Dad! What are you doing here?" I asked him in my dream. "We've been looking for you everywhere. We thought you were dead. You've been gone for 2 weeks." He looked at me befuddled and said, "What are you talking about? Of course I'm not dead." And the voice that I'd heard that spoke to me telepathically when I first attempted to take my own life said, "He's at the lake. Come and get him. He's waiting for you." What the hell, I thought, sitting up with a start in my bed. What the hell? The dream had been so vivid that I knew I had to get to the lake as soon as possible. I made excuses to my brother and mother the next morning, saying I needed to take a ride on the snowmobile. "Do you want us to come with you?" my mother asked me. "It's such a beautiful day out there, everything covered with snow, so very peaceful." "No, I hope I'm not offending you," I told my mother. "I just need some me time, that's all." "Oh, goodness gracious me! Of course I'm not offended, dear. If you need me time, of course you must have it. You've always enjoyed your own space, and I shan't be denying you that." "Don't go for too long," my brother told me. "We don't need you going missing as well." "Oh, don't be like that, Adam. Honestly, you are the end. What happened to your father is dreadful, of course it is. But we can't just live in a prison because of it. We must be able to live our lives freely, not feeling that because one person has disappeared, the rest of us are going to vanish. That's a ridiculous notion. Ruth is going out on her snowmobile, and she won't be long, will you, dear?" "But of course I won't," I assured them. "Whereabouts are you going?" asked my brother. "Are you sure you don't want us to come with you on our snowmobiles?" "I'm quite sure. I want to go out on my own." "Where did you say you were going?" my brother inquired yet again. "Near the lake." "The lake with the bridge, is that where you're going? The place where we used to go fishing a lot?" I nodded. "It's frozen at this time of the year. Why on earth would you want to go there?" "Honestly, Adam, you're acting like a police interrogator. If your sister wants to go to the lake area, why can't she go there? She's not stupid. She's not going to ride her snowmobile over the ice, are you, dear? Of course I'm not, I assured my brother. Well, don't be long, sis, said Adam, looking rather unhappy about my going off on my own. I certainly did not want to tell my brother all about my strange dream, and about my father standing on the bridge, overlooking the lake. I knew he would have laughed at me and said, "But it's a dream, sis. Surely you're not going to take that seriously." But how could I not? The Bigfoot I'd encountered all those years ago by the lake, who had persuaded me not to jump, was calling me again, and I needed to honour the call. It was probably just a dream, but I felt the need to go to the lake to assure myself of this fact. It almost felt as if I was being tugged to go there by an invisible fine thread. I whizzed through the trees on the back of my snowmobile. Everything was so quiet and so still. The world carpeted in glistening white, the trees bedecked with icicles of snow that twinkled in the light. Everything looked ethereal and delicate. When I reached the edge of the lake and parked my snowmobile, nothing was there. My father was not standing over the bridge. I felt a nauseating sense of disappointment. How could I have been so silly, so gullible, to believe a dream, and to take it so seriously? But it had felt so real, so vivid, almost as if a secret-coded message lay within the dream itself. All of a sudden, in my peripheral vision, I saw several flashes of what I can only describe as blue light, similar to that of a police vehicle, but this was high up on the top of the trees. The blue light began to whirl around in a circle, and there was a prism of golden dust around it. It was making a whirling sound, like a rotary beater, but at a very high volume. What the hell was that? The blue light flashing continued, happening way above the trees. It got my undivided attention. The noise began to sound like several turkeys in a fluster, trying to scuttle away. I do not know how to explain this to you, but that was when I saw that something was on top of the trees watching me, high up there, and I saw a humanoid-like figure. I'm not sure what he was wearing. The details are too obscure in my mind. It might have been one of those one-piece suits. I'm not sure. Shiny and black, I suspect. But I was drawn to the face, that although human possessed bulging bug-like eyes that did not look remotely human at all. I hurriedly looked away, pondering what I should do, for if this being with the bug-like eyes knew that I had seen him, I was scared of the potential consequences of my fate. I had a sense that this thing would not have wanted me to know it was there. It continued to scrutinize me, its fiery eyes burning into the back of my skull, as if someone was blowing hot air on my neck. It was the weirdest, most confounding experience of my entire life, but I've kind of got used to weird living in Alaska. I continued to pretend not to see this entity. Then once again I heard the Bigfoot's voice in my head, the same voice I'd heard in my dream, and the one I'd heard on the day that I was on the bridge, when I'd attempted to take my own life all those years ago. The voice was authoritative and firm. "That's right. Pretend you have not seen him. Act like you don't know he's there. It's very important. He mustn't know you've seen him, or he will cause you harm." I'm not sure how that entity was standing up on top of the tree like that, but I knew he was not of this world. I also knew that he must under no circumstances know that I'd actually seen him. That's when I saw my father. He just appeared on the bridge, when moments before he had definitely not been there. And when he saw me, his face lit up with recognition and relief. At first I thought I was seeing a ghost. My dad had been missing for 2 whole weeks. He had disappeared into thin air in the wild tundra of the Alaskan Triangle, while sledging with huskies and with a group of Scandinavian tourists. He had disappeared into a mist and had never been seen again. It was almost like he had been teleported here onto that bridge. But what was he doing here? Could I actually be sure that this was him, and not some kind of holographic projection that was trying to emulate my father, to lure me in, like the worm at the end of a fisherman's line. It wouldn't be the first time it had happened here in Alaska. I mean, I'd heard of stories and legends concerning the Kushtaka, otherwise known as Ottoman, here in Alaska, well known for impersonating the ones we love in order to deceive us. I had to be sure that this was not some kind of trick. I ran up to my father gingerly, with a vacillating hesitancy, desperate to throw my arms around him, but I had to be cautiously restrained. I asked him a question that only my father would know the answer to. "Dad, what was the name of the little bird we took in, that fell from the tree when I was 10 years old? We rescued it, and he was able to fly again. Do you remember?" My father looked perplexed.
"Ruth, sweetheart, you ask the strangest questions. Let's see, what was his name? Big Bird, wasn't it?"
"Why did I choose to call him Big Bird, Dad? Do you remember?"
"Of course I remember," he laughed. "Why would I forget a thing like that? Was it not because he was tiny, and you wanted him not to feel little, so you decided to give him a big name, to boost his self-esteem and confidence? You thought it would help him to fly?"
I grinned broadly. I threw my arms around my father, giving him a huge hug, tears pouring down my cheeks. "Dad, where the hell have you been all this time?" I asked him.
"I'd like to ask you the very same thing. I've been looking for you everywhere, but you wouldn't answer me."
"No, Dad, I'm being serious. Where have you been? You were sledging in the Alaskan Triangle. Remember, your best friend Marcus was sick with pneumonia. You were looking after his dogs for him. You took out some Scandinavian tourists along the tundra. In the Alaskan Triangle, don't you remember? On Marcus's sledge. And then you just disappeared into a mist with a blue light. You walked into it and were gone for 2 whole weeks." My father looked at me with concern in his eyes.
"Sweetheart, you're not making any sense as far as I'm concerned. I don't know what you're talking about. I know Marcus is fine. He hasn't had pneumonia as far as I know. And I never took out Scandinavian tourists on a sledging trip in the tundra. I think I would remember something like that, don't you? What on earth are you talking about, love? Are you sure you're all right? You didn't fall over and bump your head, did you?"
"Of course not, Dad. But what about today? What happened today? How did you get here?"
"Well, I would think you would know that. You came with me, did you not, Ruth? We came to the lake on our snowmobiles. Don't you remember?" said my father. "Your brother said he didn't want us to be too long. You wanted to see what the bridge looked like covered with snow, don't you remember?" I gave my dad a watery smile. I mean, what could I say? He had no idea he'd been missing for 2 weeks. And a memory lapse of 2 weeks is a long time. He had no idea he'd been missing for so long. And he appeared to have some kind of a false memory, coming out with me this morning on a snowmobile, when that had never happened. I glanced very carefully towards the tree, where I'd seen the man with the bug eyes. He was still watching us intently on top of the tree, and I pretended not to see him. But I'm in no doubt that in some way he was responsible for the abduction of my father, and had wiped my father's memory clean away. But why had he decided to bring my father back, with a false memory and amnesia that had stolen over 2 weeks of his life? As my father and I walked towards the snowmobile, I nearly fainted when my dad's snowmobile was parked next to mine, as if we'd both come out today, and that had not happened. I have no concept of being able to explain the strange set of circumstances, since I had come to the lake all on my own. I decided to say nothing to my father. I didn't want to confuse him. He genuinely believed we had ridden our snowmobiles to the lake together, and the strangest thing of all was that there was 2 sets of snowmobile tracks in the snow. He had no memory of his disappearance whatsoever. All of a sudden I heard the strange whirling sound again, and looked up towards the tree very cautiously. I saw a flash of blue, and then a flash of white light, and the man with the bug eyes vanished.
but there was a strange smell of ozone in the air that was far from pleasant. As we reached our snowmobiles, I turned around to see the Bigfoot standing in the trees. I recognized him at once.
"We got him back for you," he said into my head. "He has no memory of what happened to him. The evil took him."
And with that the Bigfoot glided away and was gone from my sight, and I was in no doubt that he had helped in some bizarre way to bring my father back, although how he had helped I could not imagine, and maybe it's best I don't know all the details, because I'm sure what happened to my dad was far from good. There are no words to describe the look on my mother's and my brother's face when me and my dad just sauntered into the cabin, as if we'd never been away. My mother threw her arms around my dad, tears spilling down her cheeks.
"I knew you weren't dead! I knew you were coming back! Thank God you're all right, George!" "Of course I'm all right, sweetheart," said my father. "What are you on about? I told you Ruth and I were snowmobiling together. We went to the lake. It's frozen at this time of the year, of course. We wanted to see the snow on the bridge. You're acting as if I've been to the moon and back."
My mother continued to hug my dad, refusing to let him go. He looked completely confounded.
"To us, sweetheart, you may as well have been to the moon and back," my mother said. "No, seriously, Dad," said Adam. "This is not a joke. Where on earth have you been? You've been missing for 2 whole weeks. You were out on the tundra with the Huskies and some Scandinavian tourists. There was a strange blue light and some mist. You walked into the mist and were never seen again. But now you're here as if nothing happened at all. Dad, we thought you were dead. Do you realize how serious this is?" "Son, I don't mean to be rude, but you're rambling all the same stuff and nonsense your sister was going on about moments ago. Of course I've not been missing. Don't you remember we had breakfast this morning together as a family? Ruth and I decided to snowmobile together up to the frozen lake, the one with the bridge. Why have you forgotten what we did today? There must be something in the water if you ask me." "Dad, you're the one that's not making sense. You really have been missing for 2 weeks. We've been worried sick about you. You claiming to have breakfast with us this morning never happened. Nor did you go off with Ruth on a snowmobile this morning. Even though you came back on your snowmobile, I have no idea how that happened," said my brother, looking completely confounded. "It's true, darling. I know it's very confusing for you," my mother told our father. "You've been missing for 2 weeks. You were out on the tundra with Marcus's dogs. Do you not remember any of it?" My father was visibly upset that he had no memory, as if a chunk of well over 2 weeks of his life was now missing. I think in the beginning he thought we were messing with him, until the detective on the case informed him that he had indeed been missing for 2 weeks. And even his best friend Marcus affirmed to him that he had indeed taken his huskies onto the tundra, because recently Marcus had had a bout of pneumonia and was still recuperating from it. When my father realized that he had been missing for over 2 weeks, he went to visit a doctor to have blood tests done and a medical evaluation, but everything came back normal, although he did have strange horseshoe-shaped bruises all over his body that the doctors could not explain at all. It was as if he'd been poked and prodded a little, but he hadn't lost weight, and he was in remarkably good health, and his brain scans came back perfectly normal. My father also went to a hypnotherapist, but it seemed he could not be regressed to those 2 weeks of his life, which appeared to have been a blank to my dad. There was an article in a paper that read, "Anchorage man loses memory, goes missing for 2 weeks, and returns home with no memory of what transpired." But we know differently. Something happened to my dad on that tundra, and yet despite everything, he came back to us. Could the man I'd seen on the tree been some kind of extraterrestrial? I cannot be sure. But whatever happened to my dad,
I'm actually glad he has no memory of those 2 weeks, because it might be traumatic for him to have to remember an inauspicious event like that. 10 years later. Harry's account. My name is Harry, and I'm 10 years old. I love going to stay with my pops and my Grammy in their cabin in the woods. I live in Anchorage with my mum, Ruth, and my dad, David. They got married 12 years ago. My mother met my dad in Anchorage when she was shopping one day in the grocery store. They were both arguing over the last packet of cinnamon and raisin bagels in the grocery store. So in the end, they tossed a coin over the bagels. My dad should have been a gentleman and given my mother the bagels, because that's what gentlemen should do. But my dad is very greedy and always concerned about filling his stomach with lots and lots of food. My dad is like a skinny string bean, and no matter what he eats, he stays thin. My mother agreed to throwing a coin for the bagels, so my dad said if it was tails that my mum would have to go out to dinner with him. My mummy sadly lost the bet, so she had to go to dinner with my greedy dad, even though I'm sure she didn't want to, as my dad had been so mean over the bagels. I think my mother must have decided my dad wasn't too bad after all, as in the end she married him, and 2 years later they had me. My dad is always saying my mum could have done so much better than him. And I hate to say this, but I kind of agree with him. Not to be mean, of course, but because my dad is useless at hunting. Everyone knows that a man should be skilled at hunting, but my dad is a terrible hunter. He scares the animals away, and he's such a poor shot. Even my pop says I'm a much better hunter than him. But we must keep it a secret, or it'll hurt my dad's feelings if we tell him how bad he really is. My pop says it's rude to tell people things that hurt them, like if their hair looks funny or if they have a big pimple in the middle of their nose. My parents were both going overseas to England, to Ireland and to Scotland on holiday, and they were leaving me at my grandparents' to stay at their cabin for 3 whole weeks, where I would do my schoolwork from home with my grandmother helping me out. I was sad to miss out on school because me and my best friend Scott hang out together all the time. So I knew I'd miss him a lot because I wouldn't be able to play with him for the next 3 weeks. But my mum says absence makes the heart grow fonder. So when Scott and I see each other again, we'll be even better friends than we were before. I hope she's right about that. I love my grandparents very much, and I enjoy staying over at the cabin because they always spoil me. My Grammy says she spoils me because grandchildren are meant to be spoilt. My mummy told me all about the time my grandfather disappeared on the tundra in the Alaskan Triangle when sleigh riding with huskies. But my pops, he's got no memory of the event. I personally never forget anything, so I think it's very strange to forget a whole 2 weeks of your life like that. 2 weeks is a long time, but old people can be very forgetful. My Grammy can't even remember how old she is. She said she stopped counting once she got to 55. Maybe she's not very good at math. My Grammy says lots of people go missing every year from the Alaskan Triangle, but nobody knows what's happened to them. I'm just glad that Pops came back home again. Otherwise I wouldn't have a Pops, and that would be horrible. I tell anyone I meet to be very careful of mists and blue lights and anything that smells of ozone. I know some mists can swallow you whole, like Jonah in the Bible was swallowed up by a whale. Luckily he got spat out, and so did my Pops. But not everybody is that lucky, so you need to be very careful of them. I know after my Pop story I will never walk into a mist,
I've always been interested in the subject of Bigfoot because both my grandmother and my mother have seen Bigfoots before, but they didn't want to tell me the details of their story. It's not unusual for people who've had Bigfoot encounters to be very secretive about what happened to them, and I'm not sure why. My Grammy says it's 'cause it's secrets, and secrets are not meant to be shared. But she said one day that I might have a secret of my own that I won't want to tell anybody about. It'll be so cool to have a secret of my own. Scott's grandmother, Mrs. Pangle, said she met a Bigfoot once, but she doesn't want to tell me her story, so it's a little upsetting. But what can you do? Because her story is also a secret. I've been praying to God for a long time because Mrs. Bollinger at Sunday school says that if you want something badly enough, you have to ask God for it. She says if you ask, you will receive. I feel a little annoyed because I've been asking God to see a Bigfoot since I was 7 years old, and 3 years has gone by and God has still not answered my prayers. But Mum says God's a very busy man and my prayer is not urgent. She says there's starving children in Africa that need God's attention first. My Grammy says it's because in heaven there are millions of prayer requests and the angels are struggling to get through them all. I keep wondering how long it's going to take to get to mine, so that God will give my prayer request attention. But Grammy says that patience is a virtue, which really sucks because I hate waiting for anything for too long. You have to wait a whole year for Christmas and Thanksgiving to come around again, so I'm not very good at waiting. When I stay at my Grammy's cabin, I stay in my mother's old bedroom, where she slept when she was a little girl. My Grammy turned the room into a special room just for me, and it's got lovely views over the woods. My Grammy doesn't really like me to play too far away from the cabin because she says I'm her responsibility and that Mum would be very angry if anything bad were to happen to me.
Just so you know, Harry, I'm making some jams, my Grammy calls out to me. So you're only allowed to play in the yard. You're not to go into the wood grove, do you understand? I need to be able to see you from the kitchen window. I nodded. Yes, Grammy, I told her. Good boy, now off with you. I don't need you in my hair, and I don't want you coming into the kitchen with the sugar boiling like this. You might get badly burnt. I know how your little fingers always seem to find their way into the cake mixes and frostings, and we can't have that, can we, Harry? Now run along and stay in the yard. I need to make a whole lot of strawberry jams for the store cupboard. My Grammy didn't see that I was crossing my fingers. Everybody knows when you cross your fingers behind your back, even if you promise to do something, it doesn't count, which means I could go and climb the big tree in the grove because my promise is disqualified. My grandfather was sitting in the living room reading a book. He didn't notice me when I ran outside. My Pops loves reading books, and when he's focused on his reading, he never notices anything else going on around him. Grammy says it's 'cause he's absorbed. My Grammy was watching me a little playing around in the yard from the kitchen window, but then she forgot to watch me anymore, and that's when I slank into the woods and ran towards the burly oak tree. It's the best oak tree in the whole wide world. It's 300 years old. My mummy climbed it a lot when she was little. It's easy to climb because it's got big boughs, and when you get to the top of the tree, you can see a whole lot for miles around. It's a great lookout point. It's funny when Grammy tells me not to do something. It makes me want to do it all the more. I'm not exactly sure why, but I was pleased with myself when I got to the top of the oak tree that fringed the edge of the meadow. When you get to the top of the tree, you can see a whole lot for miles around. It's a good lookout point.
So I got to the top of the tree and I sat on a branch and I watched everything. Because I didn't have to climb up and down like you do with lots of other trees. I could sit there on the branch. And that was when I heard the voices, so I began to panic. My heart was pounding loudly in my chest like a bird stuck in a chimney. I thought my Grammy had come after me with Pops 'cause she knew I'd been naughty and wandered into the woods. My Grammy can be scary when she gets angry 'cause her face goes all red and her eyes look like they're full of fire and her voice begins to quiver and quake like a miniature earthquake. Even Pop doesn't like it when Grammy gets cross because he tells her to calm down. I held my breath as the voices got closer and closer. I was happy to hear that it wasn't Grammy or Pops. But then I remembered no one should be on our property. So where were the voices coming from? They got closer and closer and the voices were foreign. I couldn't understand the funny language they were speaking. Tokalika, notoloba dikakwana, lono salina, haki twakasa, ha polaki kwa. That was when I looked through the trees, and that's when I saw 2 Bigfoots, a female and a male. They were very big. I nearly fell down from the tree. I was so shocked. The male Bigfoot was patting the female on the back, as if he was saying, "Well done." They spoke so fast and appeared to be excited about something. But then they both stopped short in their tracks and said nothing. They looked at each other, and then they looked straight up at the oak tree where I was hiding. How did they know that I was there? I was kind of scared 'cause they were very, very big. I had heard Bigfoots were big before, but I wasn't prepared to see something this big. I clung to the branch. My breathing was fast, and then the 2 Bigfoots stared at me. The male nodded at me very politely, and the female spoke to me in my head without any words, and she said, "Nice to meet you, young man." And then they continued to talk together, and they just glided away and were gone. So I suppose I can't complain, 'cause God finally got to my prayer request after all. So there you are. That's my story.
Wow, what an incredible story. I really enjoyed it all. I loved all the encounters of Bigfoot, and I loved all the mystery, surrounding the Alaskan triangle, the mist, the man on top of the tree, the strange blue light. What an incredible story. The men in black, very mysterious, and I love stories like that. I hope you felt the same way as I did. Until next time, goodbye and good night.